The Roman Empire, whose name has become synonymous with power, law, and incredible conquest. Her legions are the epitome of iron discipline and invincible power that have conquered half the known world. We are used to seeing them on the Arc de Triomphe, in heroic films, as fearless warriors carrying the Roman order. Their images are etched in marble, celebrating valor and resilience. But have you ever wondered what the real, unvarnished price of that greatness was? What did those who had worn heavy armor for years, fought for every piece of land, and bled for the ambition of emperors and senators really feel? Think about it. What do the most sophisticated torture have in common with the daily routine of a Roman legionnaire? The answer lies in the ability to cause maximum suffering. Today we will reveal 10 shocking facts that will forever change your understanding of the glorious history of Rome and show the true, disgusting face of the lives of its soldiers. Are you ready to learn why every day of a Roman legionnaire was a struggle not only against an external enemy, but also against hunger, disease, grueling labor, and the constant threat of death that awaits not only on the battlefield, but also within the walls of your own camp? If you want to find out what made the life of a Roman soldier a living hell on earth, watch this video to the end. Roman discipline is not just an order, it is an instrument of merciless control, brought to the level of psychological terror that can forever break the spirit of a person. Decimation was one of the most appalling and humiliating punishments inflicted on legions or individual cohorts who had shown cowardice in battle, rebelled, or suffered an ignominious, inexplicable defeat that threatened the prestige and invincibility of Rome. This was not an isolated random act of rage, but a very official, if extremely rare, but therefore even more shocking and effective measure of influence, used only in the most desperate cases. The last known case of decimation occurred under Marcus Licinius Crassus during the Spartacus Revolt. This episode, described by Plutarch, still causes tremors. The essence of decimation was as follows. The entire guilty unit, for example, a cohort of 480 people, was lined up, and every 10th soldier was chosen by lot from its composition, casti desati soldat. Then these poor wretches, chosen by blind fate, were executed by their own comrades who were forced to beat the doomed men to death with clubs or stones. This was not just a punishment for a misdemeanor, it was a public, demonstrative execution carried out by the hands of those who yesterday were your brother in arms, shared with you a meager ration, shelter, and risked their lives together. Try to imagine this nightmare. Your unit has been disgraced. You're standing in a line steeped in tension and fear, and you're waiting to see if it's your lot to be the one who's about to be beaten to death by your own friends. You see their faces, their own suffering, but they are forced to submit. And if the die does not fall to you, you, with trembling hands and a soul torn with horror, are forced to pick up a stone or a club and participate in this terrible, bloody massacre of your comrade. Refusing would mean that you yourself would be charged with disobedience and probably suffer the same or even more painful punishment. It wasn't just a way of punishing cowardice or rebellion, it was a method of breaking the will, instilling a paralyzing existential fear of one's own superiors, and turning comrades in arms into each other's executioners. Decimation was the clearest example of the fact that for Rome, the life of an individual soldier was worthless compared to the maintenance of absolute, unquestioning discipline and the display of unlimited, ruthless power. It didn't just frighten the enemy, it made the soldiers fear their own commanders more than any other, even the most formidable enemy. This fear was the cornerstone of the Roman war machine, cementing it on the blood and terror of its own citizens. What is the price of service when your commanders are ready to destroy you with a slow and humiliating death for a comrade's mistake? Roman legionnaires were not only soldiers who masterfully wielded weapons, but also unsurpassed, highly efficient engineers. However, this engineering genius and construction skills turned out to be a grueling, round-the-clock job that was rarely, if ever, interrupted. Their lives were an endless series of physical challenges. Each day of the campaign, the legionnaires covered from 20 to 30 kilometers. And this is not on paved roads or convenient trails, but over rough terrain, through mountain passes, dense forests, swampy swamps, arid plains, and turbulent rivers. At the same time, each soldier carried a full combat load, the weight of which reached an incredible 20-30 kilograms, and sometimes more, depending on personal belongings and the specifics of the mission. This exorbitant and oppressive load included his armor, a massive helmet, a bulky shield, 2 pylons, a formidable gladius, a sharp dagger, as well as the necessary supplies for survival and construction, a shovel or pickaxe for digging, part of a camping tent, a small hand millstone for grinding grain, a pot, several days of food supplies, a flask with water, a spare set of clothes, and a few personal items, if any. It was impossible to rest with such a load on your back, under the scorching sun or heavy rain. But the worst part began when you arrived at the place, regardless of fatigue, exhaustion, or weather conditions. The soldiers didn't rest for a minute. From the word absolutely, immediately the construction of a fortified marching camp, castrum, began, which was supposed to be ready for full defense within a few hours. This meant digging deep ditches, fossae, erecting high earthen ramparts, ager, setting up palisades of pointed logs, vallum, which the legionaries themselves chopped, hewed, and dragged, and then drove into the ground. This was followed by the construction of makeshift barracks and tents to house thousands of people. The construction of such a camp, capable of withstanding a sudden enemy assault and protecting the entire legion, took hours of hard, continuous physical labor, which required enormous endurance, strength, and coordination of each soldier. Only after a grueling day's work could the legionnaires get a meager ration and try to rest for a few short hours before the next day, which began with a fresh round of marching and labor. This mode left no room for full recovery. It drained the soldiers' bodies and spirits to the limit, making them vulnerable. Many died not in battle with the enemy, but from overwork, heat stroke, especially in hot regions, frostbite in the northern campaigns, colds, pneumonia, and other illnesses caused by constant physical exertion, lack of sleep, and lack of proper rest, even before they saw the enemy or bared their gladius. Their lives were a constant race for survival, where the body was a tool and fatigue was another deadly opponent. What is the price of heroism if it is measured in broken bones and eternal fatigue? Despite the apparent wealth and prosperity of the great Roman Empire, the Roman soldiers' diet was far from plentiful and varied, often bordering on survival and chronic malnutrition. The mainstay of their diet was wheat, most often in the form of whole grains, which the soldiers had to grind themselves on hand millstones and bake primitive bread or cook porridge if there were any conditions. Meager portions of dried meat or lard, a source of fat but often with a rancid smell, a small piece of hard cheese, and an extremely important but absolutely tasteless drink, pasca. Pasca was water mixed with vinegar, which helped quench thirst in conditions of heat and physical exertion, and also served as a kind of antiseptic, although with questionable effectiveness in the fight against diseases. Fresh vegetables, fruits, legumes, and other sources of vital vitamins were extremely rare, and available only when the legion was in stable garrisons with established supplies in peaceful provinces, or had the opportunity to plunder the surrounding land, which in itself spoke about morale and means of survival. The main problem was not only the monstrous monotony and almost complete lack of necessary nutrients, but also the extremely unreliable logistics of the Roman army. During long marches over long distances, deep incursions into enemy territory, or prolonged sieges, supplies were often disrupted, depleted, or even non-existent due to enemy sabotage, weather conditions, or inefficiency of wagon trains. In such conditions, soldiers could sit for months on starvation rations that barely kept them alive, or eat literally what they could get on the go. These could be roots, game accidentally caught, if time and opportunity allowed, or most often something that could be taken away from the local population by looting and violence. Constant malnutrition, lack of a full and balanced diet led to massive beriberi, especially scurvy, a disease caused by acute vitamin C deficiency, leading to bleeding gums, tooth loss, ulcers, general weakness, and death. Chronic exhaustion, physical weakness, decreased immunity, and, as a result, a sharp decrease in combat capability. At Tadaha, this made legionnaires easy prey for diseases, which we will discuss in more detail in the next paragraph. But even here it is clear that famine was as merciless and deadly an enemy as the barbarians. Can you imagine being sent to your death, demanding maximum physical and mental commitment from you, but not even providing the minimum necessary to maintain life and health, forcing you to literally survive on pasture? It was a daily struggle for every bite, for every drop of energy AI, where the feeling of hunger was a constant companion, reminding you of your low status and spending power. Statistics are relentless. The death rate from disease in the Roman army was many times, if not dozens of times, higher than the death rate directly on the battlefield. Ancient medicine, despite some achievements, was extremely primitive, and the living conditions in marching camps, barracks, and besieged cities, a real hotbed of deadly infections. Typhoid, dysentery, malaria in swampy areas, various skin diseases, tetanus. These diseases were constant, invisible companions of legionnaires, claiming more lives than any weapon. The lack of adequate sanitation, overcrowding in crowded tents and barracks, the inability to observe basic hygiene, the use of poor, quality or contaminated water, dirty hands and tools, as well as a meager diet that weakens the immune system. All this contributed to the lightning spread of epidemics. Even a minor scratch received during a hike or training session could lead to a purulent infection, sepsis, and, as a result, painful amputation of the limb without anesthesia or a quick, painful death. A common cold or flu in such conditions often turned into fatal pneumonia. Infirmaries, if they existed in a more or less developed form, could offer only the most basic types of care: wound dressing, poultices, bloodletting, and possibly primitive painkillers. Thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of soldiers died in whole camps, not from the swords of their enemies, but from debilitating fever, bloody diarrhea, or festering wounds, far from home and loved ones. What was the price of glory for those who died in the throes of illness, exhausted and alone, and not heroically on the battlefield, as the myths tell us? Historical evidence and archaeological evidence confirm the horrific scale of the problem. For example, excavations of Roman camps often find mass graves that are not related to battles, which indicates a high mortality rate from epidemics. Roman doctors, despite their knowledge of anatomy and surgery, which were very advanced for that time, especially in the field of trauma treatment, had no idea about microbes and viruses. This meant that any attempts to treat infectious diseases were more intuitive than scientifically based, and often amounted to symptom relief. For example, Hippocrates and Galen, prominent figures of ancient medicine, made a huge contribution to the development of healing, but their methods were devoid of modern knowledge about pathogens. As a result, even the most talented doctors could only watch as diseases ravaged the ranks of legionnaires. Water was one of the main sources of infection. On their campaigns, soldiers often drank from rivers, lakes, or poorly protected wells that could be contaminated with both human and animal waste. The lack of boiling or purifying water made it an ideal breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. This led to massive outbreaks of dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases, which quickly dehydrated and weakened the soldiers. The food also left much to be desired. The legionnaires' ration, although quite high in calories, often consisted of monotonous and not always fresh products. Grain, crackers, lard, and occasionally meat were the main ingredients. A lack of fresh vegetables and fruits led to vitamin deficiencies, which in turn weakened the donkey's immune system, making soldiers more susceptible to infections. Scurvy caused by vitamin C deficiency was a frequent companion of prolonged sieges and hikes, causing bleeding gums, tooth loss, and general weakness. In addition, constant marches and lack of proper rest aggravated the situation. Overwork, lack of sleep, and stress made the soldier's body vulnerable. In the conditions of constant military operations, when one campaign was replaced by another, and there was not enough time to recover between them, the legionnaires' immunity was constantly under pressure. The camps, despite their apparent order, quickly turned into hotbeds of unsanitary conditions. The lack of regular cleaning, the accumulation of waste, and cramped living in tents or barracks created ideal conditions for the spread of lice, fleas, and other disease vectors. These insects not only caused skin diseases, but could also carry dangerous infections such as typhus. The Romans, realizing the scale of the problem, made some attempts to solve it. For example, they built baths and aqueducts to provide cities with clean water and hygiene opportunities. However, in the context of constant military campaigns and temporary camps, these achievements were often inaccessible. Military doctors, medici, were part of the legion, but their capabilities were limited. They could provide first aid on the battlefield, perform simple surgical operations, amputations, removal of arrows, and give herbal decoctions. But in the face of epidemics, their knowledge and arsenal of tools were powerless. Thus, even if the warrior survived the battle, he was faced with a much more insidious and inevitable threat, an invisible enemy that could take his life at any moment, without the ability to fight back. The Roman Empire, being a constantly expanding state, was in a state of almost continuous wars. Her legions were at the forefront of this process, which meant that their service was an endless series of campaigns, and battles. Service in the army, according to official rules, lasted 20-25 years for a citizen legionnaire, and these 2 decades, or even a quarter of a century, were filled with grueling marches, skirmishes, major battles, sieges, and punitive operations. Vacation was an extremely rare event, available only to a select few or under exceptional circumstances, and then usually only for a very short period of time. Soldiers spent decades away from home, their families, and their normal civilian life. They have crossed continents, seen many peoples and lands, but at what cost? Their lives were a harsh, monotonous, and dangerous routine, consisting of changing military camps, deserted towns, border forts, and bloody battlefields. Lack of proper rest, constant psychological stress, chronic lack of sleep, and the expectation of death led to severe combat fatigue and what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. Although these conditions, of course, were not known, and even more so, were not treated at that time. Many of those who survived the horrors of war returned home broken, physically maimed or mentally traumatized, unable to adapt to normal life in peace. Their heroism often resulted in endless suffering after the service. Constant readiness for battle and the need to be in full combat. Readiness required incredible endurance and psychological resilience from legionnaires. Each day could bring a new threat, an ambush, a surprise attack, or the start of a large-scale battle. This constant tension made it impossible to relax and recover. Even in peacetime, when there was no active fighting, soldiers were busy building roads, bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications. They were not only warriors, but also engineers, builders, and laborers, which further increased their physical exertion and reduced their time to rest. Long marches, sometimes hundreds or thousands of kilometers long, were common. The legionnaires carried heavy equipment, including weapons, armor, construction tools, and some food. Daily marches could range from 20 to 30 kilometers, and in conditions of forced crossings, up to 40-50. It was exhausting even for trained soldiers. Not surprisingly, many suffered from chronic joint pain, back problems, and other physical ailments that accumulated over the years. The psychological impact of the war was no less devastating. Seeing the death of comrades, participating in brutal massacres, living in constant fear for their lives, all this left deep scars on the psyche of soldiers. The lack of mechanisms for psychological rehabilitation meant that these injuries remained untreated. Modern research on PTSD shows how devastating this condition can be, and yet Roman legionnaires experienced it without any understanding or support. Many returned home and found it difficult to adapt to civilian life. Their world was a world of war, and a peaceful existence seemed alien. They may have suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, aggression, apathy, or depression. Some became outcasts, unable to find a place in the society after decades spent on the battlefield. The economic situation of veterans was also difficult. Although some received allotments of land or cash payments after service, this did not always guarantee a comfortable existence. Many were forced to start their lives from scratch, often with poor health and no skills applicable in civilian life. Thus, the severity of the service did not end with demobilization. For many, it continued in the form of chronic illnesses, mental disorders, and adjustment difficulties. Their sacrifices often went unnoticed and unappreciated, and the promised glory was only a bitter aftertaste of endless suffering. Roman discipline was maintained not only by the instilled fear of decimation, but also by a system of incredibly cruel, humiliating, and painful corporal punishments that could be applied on a daily basis. Centurions, cohort commanders, and legions carried a special staff, the vites, made from a dried vine. This rod was not just a symbol of power, but also a tool for immediate physical impact. The centurion had every right to beat up soldiers with it for the slightest disobedience, sluggishness, a mistake in the formation, violation of the rules, or even simply for being slow. The blows with vites were incredibly painful, leaving deep, long-lasting bruises and scars that were a constant reminder of the strict and merciless regime. The punishments could have been much harsher. For serious offenses such as looting, desertion, theft, or disobeying orders, soldiers could be flogged, fustigatio, where several soldiers took turns beating the offender with sticks until they lost consciousness or even died. Even more terrifying was the lash, which could literally rip the skin off the body, leaving deep wounds. For state crimes such as bullying or serious rebellion, soldiers could be executed, such as crucifixion, although this was more often applied to slaves and non-citizens, or stoning. The soldier's body, his life, his dignity, all this belonged to Rome. The empire did not hesitate to demonstrate its absolute power by maiming and destroying those who served it, inspiring terror and suppressing any resistance. What is the price for a man whose body and spirit are constantly subjected to such humiliation, pain, and fear by those who should have been his protectors and leaders? This system of punishments was a fundamental part of Roman military culture. It was designed to ensure unconditional submission and absolute discipline, without which, as the Romans believed, it was impossible to build an effective army. The centurion, who was at the head of a century, from 80 to 100 people, was not only a tactical commander, but also a chief overseer, responsible for the order and execution of orders. Ego Vitus was a symbol of his power and willingness to use it without hesitation. The soldiers lived in constant fear of this rod, knowing that any offense, however minor, could result in immediate and painful punishment. In addition to individual punishments, there were also collective ones, the most famous of which is decimation. Although it was rarely used and only for the most serious crimes, such as mass flight or cowardice in the face of the enemy, its existence hung like a sword of Damocles over the heads of legionaries. Decimation meant the execution of every 10th soldier in the division, chosen by lot by his own comrades. Not only was it a horrific act of violence, but it was also a powerful psychological tool that destroyed the sense of camaraderie and forced everyone to think about the consequences of their actions for the entire unit. The fear of decimation was so great that it served as a powerful incentive to maintain discipline even in the most desperate situations. The reasons for this brutality were rooted in the Roman worldview. The Romans believed in the need for strict discipline and severe punishment to maintain social stability and military power. To them, the soldier was an instrument of the state, and his personal rights and welfare were secondary to the interests of the empire. This approach, on the one hand, created a uniquely efficient and seasoned army capable of enduring unthinkable hardships and fighting to the last. On the other hand, he broke people, turning them into uncomplaining executors of the will of their commanders. Physical injuries resulting from punishments were not uncommon. Broken bones, dislocations, and deep lash cuts were all part of a soldier's life. And as with diseases, the treatment of these injuries was primitive, and the consequences could be long-term. A soldier who received a serious injury from punishment could be crippled for life, unable to perform their duties normally, but still continuing to serve or being thrown out to the mercy of fate without proper compensation. Thus, Roman discipline, though the cornerstone of its military power, was achieved at the cost of incredible human suffering and systematic humiliation. It was a world where fear and pain were an integral part of everyday life, and any manifestation of individuality or disobedience was severely punished. Not everyone who fought for Rome was a full Roman citizen and served in the prestigious legions. A significant and sometimes predominant part of the Roman army consisted of auxiliary troops, auxiliaries, recruited from conquered peoples, barbarian tribes, or provincials who did not have Roman citizenship. Their service was even more dangerous, disenfranchised, and humiliating. These troops were often used to perform the most risky and dirty tasks, scouting deep into enemy territory, clearing enemy settlements, flanking attacks that could quickly turn into a trap, or covering a retreat when losses were inevitable. Auxiliaries were generally less heavily armed and armored than legionnaires, received significantly lower salaries, and had no civil rights. Although after 25 years of service they could theoretically have obtained Roman citizenship for themselves and their children, as well as a large piece of land, the vast majority of them did not live to see this moment, dying in battle, from disease or from exhaustion. Auxiliaries died much more often than legionaries, since their lives were valued even less by Rome. They were perceived as expendable material and weapons, cannon fodder, that could be thrown into the thick of it without regret. For many non-Romans, this was the only, if desperate, way to gain some sort of status for themselves and their descendants. But this status was bought at an incredible price of suffering, constant threats of death, and disenfranchisement. It was the path to the Roman dream through hell on earth. The salaries of Roman soldiers, although they did exist, were often insufficient, paid irregularly, and subject to various deductions. Most of what they nominally earned was spent on buying equipment, which often had to be purchased at their own expense, food, since government supplies were not always complete, taxes, and other expenses. In fact, soldiers received a significant, and sometimes even the main part of their income, not from the treasury, but through looting and a share of the spoils of war. This created a system that not only encouraged, but actually forced soldiers to commit cruelty towards the conquered peoples, looting towns and villages, seizing valuables, enslaving the inhabitants, and appropriating livestock and food. All of this was an integral, even expected, part of a legionary's daily life during campaigns. This didn't just corrupt the soldiers into cold-blooded looters. It turned them into an effective tool of terror and suppression. Their survival, their ability to send something to their family or save up for the future, often depended on their ability to take from others, which blurred any moral boundaries and turned them into ruthless machines for plunder. Were these soldiers heroes who carried civilization, or rather hired assassins and robbers who survived off the blood and suffering of others? The answer to this question makes you think about the real price of the Roman world. Even if a soldier lived to the end of his grueling 25-year service, which was a miracle in itself, his future was far from cloudless and often sad and hopeless. A pension, which often consisted of a small plot of land in the coveted territories, usually requiring considerable effort to develop, or a small cash payment, was not always sufficient for any kind of comfortable existence. Many veterans who had been maimed in battle, suffered from chronic illnesses, had been injured in the field, or were mentally traumatized, were unable to cultivate the land or engage in heavy physical labor. They often found themselves on the margins of society, forced to live in poverty, beg for alms, or eke out a miserable existence. The Roman Empire, which required decades of loyal service, bloodshed, and countless sacrifices, did not always take care of its heroes. Their suffering after the service was often ignored, and society quickly forgot about them. The life of a veteran could be no less harsh and cruel than the life of an active soldier, only without the opportunity to become famous, get loot, or hope for something better. What is the true cost of serving the empire if after all the sacrifices, after losing decades of youth and health, you are left with nothing, thrown on the margins of society? Internal intrigues, power struggles between generals, senators, and emperors were a constant and integral part of Roman history. In this bloody game, soldiers often became unwitting but absolutely irreplaceable bargaining chips. Legions could be thrown into senseless and suicidal attacks by generals who sought personal glory and power at the expense of excessive losses of their own troops. Emperors could order mass executions or bloody purges if they suspected disloyalty or simply sought to eliminate potential rivals. A soldier could be suddenly killed in internal rebellions, civil wars when his legion was on the losing side, and the victors mercilessly dealt with the vanquished. Even inside the barracks and campground, there was a constant but not always real threat from conflicts between comrades, jealousies, competition for scarce resources, or just accidents caused by chronic fatigue, stress, and unsanitary conditions. The Roman soldier lived in a state of constant paranoia and distrust. He had to fear not only external enemies, but also his comrades, higher commanders, and even the emperor himself, whose whim could cost him his life at any moment. It was a life of constant tension, where death could come from anywhere, even from within. We were plunged into a world where iron and discipline became tools of unthinkable cruelty, and the human body was only an expendable tool on the way to the greatness of the empire. 10 shocking facts we've covered today, from the unbearable fear of decimation and monstrous marches to deadly diseases, and the lack of a future for veterans, are irrefutable evidence of how the ancient Romans, with their iron will, engineering genius, and ruthless pragmatism, turned every soldier's life into a never-ending struggle for survival. Each of these aspects was designed for one purpose: to achieve maximum efficiency in conquest and maintain total control, regardless of human suffering and sacrifice. Roman greatness was forged not only by the genius of military leaders and a flawed military machine, but also by the unimaginable torment of millions of legionaries whose lives were far worse than is generally believed, and whose stories rarely made it to the pages of triumphal annals. The history of ancient Rome is not only about power and achievements, great deeds and cultural heritage, it is also about a dark, deeply human side that is capable of unthinkable atrocities and ruthlessness in order to assert its dominance. To this day, when you look at the magnificent ruins of Roman cities, bridges, and triumphal arches, it is worth remembering what a price this glory was achieved and what unimaginable suffering was endured by those who fell under the onslaught of the Roman military machine, living their lives in a real hell on earth. If this deep dive into the dark side of Roman military history has left you wondering about the nature of power, and human brutality, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new videos about the most mysterious, shocking, and sometimes frightening countries and regions in history. Click on the bell to be the first to learn about our new releases and continue to explore the past with us, revealing its non-obvious secrets.